So these remarks are on Donna Haraway's now celebrated canonical essay, A Cyborg Manifesto. There are a few different versions of this, any of which it is completely legitimate to read, cite, quote from. Here are three of them, of which there are many more. In my remarks, I will draw a little bit on some background sources, including these first three works, which are essays from the 1960s that elaborate or outline the original cyborg concept as developed by Kline and Clynes. Haraway does not cite these works, but they provide some sense of the cultural context of cyborgs that informs and shapes her argument. Context is less so than concept, more about a historical backdrop. Some other remarks that inform what I say here, but you may want to draw on if you want to go a little bit further, is Julia de Cook's A White Cyborg's Manifesto, which is a critique of the Western feminist ideology governing Haraway's essay. Ronald Klein's essay, Where are the Cyborgs and Cybernetics, which also provides some historical setting for the essay. Chris Gray's The Cyborg Handbook, which is just a broad overview of scholarship on cyborgs, much of it critical in orientation. And another essay that's actually kind of interesting, it's a book, is Nicolas de Monchaux's Spacesuit, which provides actually some context for the research setting that developed the original research on cyborgs. So let's start by situating the cyborg concept in the flow of some other debates on digital culture, cybernetics. One place you could locate this essay is in terms of what Gilles Deleuze discussed in terms of control societies. Okay, according to Deleuze, in the 18th and 19th century, you had the height of disciplinary societies. So prisons, factories, schools that worked on fixing bodies in particular formations, gathering bodies and sorting them out by class and race and gender. According to Deleuze, in the 20th century, you see a shift towards control societies. Control societies are more about flows, individualization, specialization. And the reason this is important for the cyborg concept is actually at the heart of the idea of a cyborg is this notion that the human body is located in flows of communication, flows of information, and that the body is actually being adapted and reconfigured on an ongoing basis, right? So if the disciplinary society sent someone to jail, set them free, sent someone to school, set them free, the control society is constantly updating and modulating and using feedback to reconform the subjects of its society, the human bodies. Within that context, the cyborg, particularly as it's imagined by Donna Haraway, is a way of thinking about our bodies, our identities, gender, labor, sexuality, race, economics, within a control society within which individual bodies are constantly being modulated by technology. An interesting aspect that links the concept of the cyborg to the notion of the control society is that Deleuze lays emphasis on the idea that in a control society, the initiative of the governed subject is important, right? So a disciplinary society imposes control from above. It has an authority that compels bodies to adapt to its logic, to its forms. In a control society, governance relies increasingly on the input, on the feedback, on the particular qualities and characteristics of the human subject, right? So whether you're dealing with a smart learning environment or web ads or what is another example? Um, continual training and retraining of workers. There's some notion where the desire, the aspiration, the initiative, the motive, the constant feedback from the individual is important to how you're trained, to how you're educated, to how the institution services the individual. If web ads in some way control our consumption, if web ads guide our desires, they don't do so in a disciplinary way that says you must like this or you must like that. They do so by tracking individual behavior, coming up with a model of what a particular type of person is likely to be interested in, and then they give nudges that push one towards certain behaviors, certain consumptions that the individual is predisposed to be interested in. So there's a collaboration in the control society where the flows of information are shaped by feedback from the individual. The cyborg concept starts suggesting that perhaps the individual body is itself taking part in its own refashioning. It's not simply the prison warden or the teacher saying you must act this way or behave this way, but there's a kind of collaboration between the individual body, its desires and its wants, and a broader set of social imperatives that are communicated by flows. So a few remarks on the origins of the cyborg concept. So cyborg is short for cybernetic organism. It was a concept that first surfaced in the 1960s in connection with research at a mental hospital in upstate New York by the scientists Kline and Clynes. It was linked to research for NASA, and it was tied into the study of drugs, experimental biology, mental health, the space program. In particular, an overarching goal of the early research on cyborgs, of Kline and Clynes when they coined the word cyborgs, was to figure out what types of supplementation would you need to the human body to allow humans to live in space. So the spacesuit is a certain type of system where it has a dynamic feedback and communication with the organism and this technical environment constructed around the organism. So that there's a collaboration where, what's doing the living, what's doing the regulating is not just the body, but the body in cooperation with a particular technology. But it's interesting that this space research takes place in a mental hospital, right? And it's also, if you go back to the original articles, it's closely tied to research on drugs. There is an effort not just to link the body to the environment and to technology, but also to think about the body itself as somehow constantly being regulated by chemicals too. And how is it that drugs take part in shaping perception, shaping experience? And what you see, particularly when you're thinking about the control society concept, is all of these notions that drugs, space, living embodied suits might somehow refashion the organism so that the human organism becomes a cybernetic organism, a living thing that's shaped and conditioned and developing in a lively set of feedback of communication and information with its environment. These are essentially a new concept of the organism in cybernetic and informatic concepts. Now, the fact that this research develops out of work at mental hospitals is telling. As a general rule, new technologies, new research, new science frequently take marginal subjects, people who don't have full political rights, and use them as an occasion for thinking through new experimental possibilities of the future. So the mental hospital, in a way, is a place where you have complete control over the environment, or extensive control of the environment. You have particular rights to experiment. You have lots of, at least in the 1960s, you had funding available from the government to engage in experimental research. And it was also a case that in the 1960s, this was the moment when you had the explosion in new psychoactive drugs, ways of, for example, regulating schizophrenia through medication. And there was this notion that medication is a kind of technology that regulates the human body, and you have this dynamic feedback between the organism and the various medications administered to it from without that produce a kind of new form of human life. So the rise of the cyborg is really linked to a much broader set of rethinking about the relationship between the body and information, communication, and the way it's embedded in flows of its environment. And it's made possible by massive government funding for everything from space research to mental health. And it's hinting at a certain possibility of dissolving and reformulating the senses, dissolving and reformulating experience, taking the body and supplementing it, imagining that the body we've been given by nature is not eternal, is not natural, but there could be better bodies, new bodies, different bodies based on artificial supplementation, whether they're a spacesuit or whether they're drugs or whether there's some type of massive built environment. So the image on the right here comes from an early article in Life, the famous illustrated magazine, in 1960 that discussed the research of Kline and Clynes, and it gives a certain early vision of what the cyborg is, this human body that's living in an inhospitable environment thanks to special technical supplementations. You have a particular suit of sort that's mounted on the body. You have technologies that looks like it could be some type of space pack to motivate to move one through space. You also have this wire, this peculiar wire linking the body to some type of machine or instrument being held by a person in the distance. And all of these show a way in which the body itself is being, in the space age of the 60s, the body is being reimagined in terms of these information and technical flows. This is the origin of the cyborg concept. Okay, it's not just a general idea about humans and machines, but it's something that's made possible in the wake of revolutions in cybernetics, information, and computing when they intersect with the space program. So here we see two images from another, from the same Life article on the cyborg. On the bottom left, we see a mouse, which is plugged into a cyborg pump, a certain pump that administered drugs into the bloodstream of the mouse. And so you have a dynamic relation of communication, so to speak, between the pump and the mouse. And if the mouse, if the drugs and the pump connected to the mouse become part of the mouse's nervous system and its circulation system, is that pump part of the mouse's body? Kline and Clynes would say yes. The body itself has become extended through new types of technical supplementation, and the mouse was a model of what they imagined humans in general becoming. On the right, we see the tape that was printed off from a computer, predicting aspects of human pulse rate, human breath rate, and the idea was, okay, if we're trying to figure out how to launch people into space, you're going to need these environments that ensure that the human organism can survive and can respond to various stresses, various challenges faced by being on the moon. And machines would need to understand aspects of the nervous system, aspects of the biological system, and might participate in regulating and modulating the human organism the same way this mouse is regulated by the image on the bottom left. So we have this quote here from Kline and Clynes from the essay Drugs, Space, and Cybernetics, Evolution to Cyborgs from 1960. They wrote that, quote, in the past, the altering of bodily functions to suit different environments was accomplished through evolution. From now on, at least in some degree, this can be achieved without alteration of hereditary by suitable biochemical, physiological, and electronic modifications of man's existing modus vivendi, art of living, style of living. One device helpful towards the construction of cyborgs, which is already available, is the ingenious osmotic pressure pump capsule, developed by S. Rose for continuous, slow injections of biochemically active substances at a biological rate. So this starts setting up a kind of context at once scientific and technical, at the same time imaginative, fictional, speculative, in which in the 1960s, they start imagining a new evolution of the body, a new development of the body that does not rest on biology, does not rest on human evolution. It rests instead on technical supplementation, and it suggests a potential to overcome the limits of the body. These ideas are not entirely identical with cybernetics or information or digital culture, but as you see in the image on the right, in a sense, it was revolutions in cybernetics, revolutions in information theory that helped one start thinking of the body as part of these dynamic information flows. And you needed computers to monitor and regulate and govern this new idea of cyborgs, human bodies that were regulated through dynamic interactions with machine technologies.